Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. People often ask me what I do since I work for the province in immigration, but we actually do have quite a significant role, both through our Canada-BC Immigration Agreement. We have a Foreign Credential Recognition Agreement with the federal government, and also probably about $10 million in a range of settlement and integration services. So there is a role for the provinces. So I'm going to speak a little bit about good problems to have and the immigration policy landscape in British Columbia. I'm going to talk sort of about three things: our ongoing need for skilled immigrants, both because of demographics, but also because of economic growth, the challenges and opportunities that presents to us, and some of the solutions that are really complex and multifaceted, and I think not just rooted in more economic immigration, but in a much more holistic approach. So I'm going to start with talking about BC's rock star status. No, because I'm from BC, I have to sort of frame the narrative around our context. So overall, we are doing quite well. Despite some of our immigration challenges, it's really happening in the underpinning of a good news story. We have very strong GDP growth, 8% since 2011, 3.3 in 2015. We are projected to lead the country again in growth. And our growth is really sort of underpinned on an increasingly diversified economy. The pie chart is employment by sector in British Columbia. I think there's often a historical perception that most of the jobs are resource-based, but you can see that we're really, like many other economies, transitioning to knowledge-based, and trade actually encompasses sales, real estate, banking. So actually a fairly diversified economy, and some really interesting expansion in things like technology, creative, film and TV. There's tons of work in Vancouver and the surrounding area. In tourism, we had an 11% increase in visits over last year. Our minister is also the Minister of Tourism, so I have good access to those stats. But we benefit hugely from both our friends to the south and others, and tourism employs a lot of people in British Columbia. And then we also have interesting emerging sectors like apparel, Lululemon, Aritzia, Arc'teryx, really sort of growing and hiring an increasingly diverse skill representation. And half of our labor force is in those knowledge-based or trade-related industries, and I didn't believe this, but apparently 3 out of 5 people are under 44 years of age, so we're younger than I thought. So overall, we're doing pretty well. And our primary focus and government direction is really to maximize the domestic workforce. So the real prioritization is that British Columbians are the foundation of our workforce strategy and the underpinning for growth. And I would say that British Columbians include a real focus on everybody. So we often have this sort of binary debate about an immigrant, when did they become a British Columbian? And I would say that this includes permanent residents, this includes all newcomers, this includes underrepresented groups in the labor market. Our first piece is investing in education and skills training, primarily under our BC Skills for Job blueprint that has a focus on youth and Indigenous populations. But there's also a lot of efforts underway to increase participation of historically underrepresented groups in the labor market. That would also include people with disabilities, Indigenous British Columbians, newcomers. We're continuing our work to improve labor mobility between provinces, although I actually think the foundation there is fairly strong, and trying to encourage people to move to where the jobs are. But, I often say to my staff that when you make policy, you have to remember that people aren't robots, and they won't just move for a job because it's there. So we have to think holistically about, family and community and all of those things that, come into play when someone's deciding to uproot their entire life. So, despite all of those things, because we have both, so in our labor market outlook, we're projecting about 2/3 of the job openings of the future will be because of retirement, 1/3 because of growth. And probably between 25 to 30% of them will need to be filled by someone who isn't currently living in British Columbia. So whether that's through migration from other provinces or continued and ongoing immigration. So this is a chart that I often use to talk about the immigration pathway. It's meant to represent the transition of a newcomer from pre-decision, which is before someone even decides to come to Canada, through recruitment, selection, integration, and citizenship. And I've tried to to demonstrate through colors some of the areas where we have shared or concurrent or no jurisdiction with our federal partners. So a lot of the pre-decision and recruitment work is really joint, and I'm not sure we've done as much on this as we can, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Selection and integration is shared, although selection is primarily federal, but we do have the BC Provincial Nominee Program. Our current allocation is $5,800, that's for principal applicants, and it's a job offer-based program. We just introduced legislation last year to enhance program integrity. It's always been very popular with employers, and I think given us a way to augment the federal selection streams with a bit of a made in BC approach. And I just wanted to highlight citizenship, although we don't have any jurisdiction. I really think that one of the things Corinne mentioned is crucial. I think pathways are crucial for inclusion and settlement. If there's not an opportunity for someone to become a citizen, then I don't think we can achieve full inclusion. And I think that's something that we've certainly been pushing for the last few years, is multiple pathways, more pathways, especially for semi-skilled workers who often come through the temporary foreign worker program and then don't have an existing federal pathway. So I think that's one area where there's maybe more work to do, but I think the foundation is really solid, and I think that helps a lot from an integration perspective. So the next slide is just us overlaid on the arrow. We have a website, Welcome BC. Like all government websites, it could probably use a little bit of help from the private sector. But the foundation is pretty good. It started off as our sort of settlement and attraction website when we administered federal settlement dollars, and we still have all of our information about our provincial nominee program, our foreign credential recognitions program. We actually have job profiles for every regulated job in British Columbia, along with a pathway for certification. I think the content on there is actually quite solid, and we struggle sometimes with driving the right traffic and making people aware. So I think there's lots of room there to grow, and certainly opportunities for synergies between, federal marketing and products and what we're doing, and also what other provinces are doing. I talked about the BC Provincial Nominee Program under selection. And then under integration, a couple of things that BC has. We have a program called Skills Connect, soon to be relaunched as Career Paths, which I actually think is quite an innovative and interesting federal-provincial partnership. I'm happy to talk more about that maybe in the Q&A or offline if people have questions. I think labor market attachment is a crucial area where the federal and provincial governments can work together for mutual outcomes. Skills Connect is a program that looks at skilled immigrants and getting them commensurate employment based on their either credentials or training in their country of origin. It's not a very big program numbers-wise, but it has very good outcomes and is quite wraparound. We also spend about $4 million a year on our settlement and integration services. We serve clients who are not eligible for federal services, temporary foreign workers, international students, naturalized citizens. In our new foreign worker annex that we signed last year, Corinne and I were just talking about how the last few years are kind of a blur. We got the ability to potentially secure new work permits for vulnerable temporary foreign workers who are in an employment situation where a federal or provincial law is being broken, and that's something that we're working to implement with our settlement partners across the province. I think something that we're quite happy that we were able to negotiate. We also have a one-time refugee readiness fund. It was announced by our premier in 2015, $1 million. Half of it went in partnership with ISS of BC to do a refugee hub newsletter, sort of a one-stop shop for information. The other $500,000 went to 5 communities across British Columbia to build refugee readiness teams. They are somewhat similar to LIPS, but we tried to build it out so that it wasn't duplicative. Really bringing together the health authorities, school districts, settlement partners, private sponsors, and getting the community ready to welcome and receive Syrian refugees. Through our Canada BC Job Grant, we have a specific stream for newcomers and also a specific stream for refugees. And we've had some pretty good uptake there and some pretty willing employers. And then we have our foreign qualifications recognition. So I'm just going to go quickly through 3 challenges. The first one is demographics. We're all getting older, all of us right now, while you're sitting here listening to me talk. 2016 was the first year in BC where more people left the workforce than entered. We are not having enough children to replace ourselves, and migration's not filling the gap. And, you know, please do not get mad at me at the young and old labels on this slide. A lot of the people in that old category I know are still very active in the labor market. But you can see where, you know, the blue is increasing and the yellow is sort of tapering off. So the opportunity is to increase our supply. I talked about maximizing our workforce and attracting other Canadians. We're very supportive of some of the federal initiatives to increase opportunities for international graduates. Is very, heartened by a lot of Minister McCallum's comments this morning. We have been pushing to increase overall immigration levels, as well as our provincial nominee allocation, and really leveraging labor market information at the provincial or even sub-regional level to drive economic selection. I'd like to really commend the federal government for a lot of the stuff that's being posted on open data. I think that that's really helping us, and it's also, I think, helping external partners, and I think will lead to better outcomes. And I think that, you know, I wouldn't suggest that every immigrant is an economic immigrant, but we know from things like the Settlement Outcomes Survey that most immigrants can and do work at some point. And I think there's I think we could do a better job of understanding sort of non-principal applicants, spouses, family class. Someone who works for me is, you know, in her early 20s, she's about to start a family, she's sponsoring her husband from the United States. You know, technically he'll be family class, but he has a PhD. So how can we know more about those folks, make them aware of labor market opportunities? You know, that's also, I think, a part of the supply that we don't always tap into. So the second challenge that I will talk to you right next to Corinne is jurisdiction. So, I mean, there's not really much to say here in a federation. It's a complex dance between the two of us. Our share of immigrants relative to other provinces has been declining over the last few years. There's reasons for that. And we don't have authority over levels or our PNP allocation. And I think a lot of it is just the complexity of having control over the economy and the labor market, but not necessarily having the nimbleness or responsiveness on some of the levers of immigration. And the provincial nominee program helps, but I think we would argue it's still not high enough. So I think the opportunity here is partnerships. You know, I think in a federation, the sum can be greater than the parts. We can work with our federal colleagues to serve newcomers in a variety of ways. I always say to my staff that it's amplification, not duplication. We shouldn't be fighting with the federal government over who can design the best program. We should be working together to leverage our, you know, joint resources, especially in an ongoing era of fiscal austerity. As Minister McCallum reminded us, money doesn't grow on trees. So how can we, instead of, you know, fighting for concurrent space, leverage what we both have? I think our Career Path Skills Connect program is a really good example of that. We're using both provincial and federal money, and we're able to deliver a bigger program that will help more people because of that. A couple other things. We have done some really good FQR work with Corinne's team on pre-arrival. We've worked really well with the Express Entry Employee Liaison person in British Columbia to do joint presentations, combining both our PNP stream and the federal economic streams. I think on selection, you know, we need to kind of get away from the binary economic, non-economic. We all need skilled workers, and stream shouldn't necessarily matter. I think the levels consultation framework is a very positive step in the right direction. We're very supportive of how the process went this year. I've talked about LMI and policy modifications. And then on the integration side, I think there's lots that we can do around labor market programming, probably about occupation-specific language or language that's linked to labor market, and then some community-based settlement initiatives. Okay, I will end maybe with a bit of the elephant in the room. So I really appreciated the woman who spoke earlier during Minister McCallum's piece, who's from Fort St. John. Hello, happy to talk later. Because I think that one of the big challenges is perception, that we're seeing potentially globally, if not quite yet in Canada, heightened anxiety about immigration, and that immigration is often as much about identity or tribalism as economics. There is, I think, an increased sense across the world that trade agreements perhaps have not had the benefits that everybody saw or didn't see at the time. And trade agreements often have a labor mobility component. So, changes to NAFTA, TPP, CETA, all of those things have clauses for mobility of people. And I think that we need to talk about immigration in the context that perhaps not everybody immediately sees it as an unmitigated good. So, the opportunity is better narratives. I think that it's important for us not to make assumptions that everyone is on the same page around the positive benefits of immigration. I think a space like this is fairly safe. It's full of practitioners and academics and people that are on the ground every day seeing the positive benefits and helping people. But I do think there are other people in Canada who don't share those perspectives, and it's important to try and understand why, while still standing up for things like equality, tolerance, freedom, and human rights. I think there's a better opportunity to tell our story. In a way, we're all immigrants living on Indigenous land. My father was an immigrant. My mother is a third-generation Canadian. We all came from somewhere. Migration is a part of human history, and I think that there is a better way that we can talk about that makes it seem more inclusive. I also think we can put more of a human face on it. I talked about the person who works for me who's sponsoring her husband. When we, maybe not all, but sometimes governments have a tendency to prioritize economic immigration, but a family class immigrant is somebody's husband or wife or child, and a humanitarian immigrant is fleeing a civil war, genocide, persecution. We need all three streams, and I think it's all three streams that make us great. And I also think we can support welcoming communities. One of the things I've been thinking about, because without bringing politics into it, I've been reflecting a lot on my job, given the recent US election. And I think sometimes at the macro level, people can be resistant of narratives of diversity and inclusion, and not always like it when it comes from above. But in communities, by and large, and I know there are lots of issues, people work together, usually, to kind of get through some of those issues. So I think if we can do a better job of supporting municipalities, communities to have those resources, I think settlement needs to be two ways, not just for the newcomer, but also for the community that the newcomer settles in. I think there are some places where we still have lots of work to do, frankly. And I think the second piece is, and I don't know, I'm not always sure that I believe this, but sometimes better data leads to better proof, leads to a better message. I guess this is the hard and the soft. The soft is the story, the hard is the data. Leveraging, folks in this room, research to show that immigration has positive benefits, that if we don't deal with some of our demographic shifts, there'll be huge impacts to our financial situation, that it's really a brain gain. Things like diversity, cultural competence, access to export markets, those are all good things. So I will end on this. This is what I always use to show my staff because I run a policy shop. The ideal public policy is in the nexus of the Venn diagram. You need both the evidence and the data, but then the feasibility, which is the cost, the implementation, the operations, and then the appetite, which is both political and public. And so I think as we move forward in immigration policy, we need to think, what is the evidence? Is it affordable? Is it implementable? And is there the appetite, both publicly and politically, to make it happen? Thanks very much.
Thank you.